welcome to the Beginning of Wisdom Live. I'm Andrew Schumacher, and tonight we are going to talk about Jesus and what he said about the law. And this is part 6 of our series on the Christian approach or relationship to the law, and that is what we're going to talk about tonight. So we're going to cover, we've up to this point talked about the Torah. Now we're moving, this is sort of a biblical theology thing, so we're moving from the Old Testament now into the New Testament, and of course we're starting with Jesus and his teaching itself, building on what we've already done. Certainly later we will get back into some stuff with the Old Testament to sort of flesh out some things, I think, because as you go through the basic positive presentation of anything, sometimes you do end up coming up with, there's questions and there's other things that do happen. So anyway, we're going to go ahead and jump right into it. I'm going to start this also by saying, definitely check out in the description, there is a link to this whole series. There's a playlist, I think it's called Christian Approach to the Law or something like that. And it is in there, and you can watch all the other previous 5 videos that have been done as we talk about this. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. As always, as well, we're going to do some question and answer at the end. So certainly, if you have questions, throw those in the chat. Stick the word question in front of it, in all caps preferably, and then we'll catch it and hopefully answer your question tonight if you have any questions about what we're going to talk about. So let's go ahead and jump in. So once again, just to kind of review a little bit, we're going to go over just a broad outline, a little bit of what we've talked about so far. So as we talked about, Genesis presents obedience to God in 2 ways. Number one, it does have explicit commands, which predominantly are specific to certain people at certain times. Things like don't eat the fruit, Noah build the ark, Abraham come to this land, Abraham sacrifice Isaac, things like that, that are specifically for specific people. Most of the commands look like that. And then you have most of the sins, there are narratives. Most sin is presented in a narrative. So you've got the sin of Cain killing Abel, the sin of Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery, the resisted sin of Joseph not sleeping with Potiphar's wife, and so you have these examples and many others within the book of Genesis where sins are not usually presented with specific commands, but are presented simply as if the person already knows that is a sin. Now the Torah itself also, we talked about Genesis, then we talked about the rest of the Torah where it's the giving of the law. It clearly distinguishes these things just like Genesis. It has clearly these eternal principles of justice, that the same kinds of things that are wrong in Genesis are wrong in Exodus and Leviticus and on. But then you also have laws that are specifically given to Israel and are specifically talked about that way. I give you this law because you are my people. I brought you out of Egypt, that kind of thing. So and these are religious observances. The religious observances like dietary laws, the Sabbath, the feasts, are presented differently within the Torah than the moral principles that you saw already outlined in Genesis. So those distinctions are foundational to the law, and when we come to Jesus, as we'll begin to see over the next few parts of this series, because we're going to be talking about Jesus for more than just one episode, we see that distinction continue. And so it's not that, when Jesus comes and he teaches, the law and he teaches on the law, it's not just, do away with the old thing, this is a new thing, nor is it, let's just keep doing the old thing the way it always was. Those distinctions continue to be important, but those distinctions are now set in a context of the work of Christ himself. So we'll see that as we go forward. Now, today's main point, we're going to talk about Matthew 5, 17 through 20, where Jesus introduces his general relationship to the law. So this is part of the Sermon on the Mount. We'll talk some more about the Sermon on the Mount, because this is not the only part where he talks about laws and commands by any means. Most of the sermon's about that. But this is where he begins to really introduce it. Now, one thing that we're going to do, just like we did when we were talking about the Torah itself, we're going to start with the text. We're going to draw out the meaning and not try to impose things on it. What we learn is going to come from the text. So to give you a little bit of historical context about this, and this is just to give you kind of put your head in the right space for what we're listening to. Jesus was an itinerant preacher, so he went from place to place and preached, and would have likely preached the same thing multiple times. And Matthew's account is really important for several reasons, but it's likely he preached this sermon in more than one place. And in fact, that would seem to be the case as you look at Luke, where much of the sermon is there in Luke, but with some slight differences. And skeptics like to point out, well, obviously this is the same sermon, but look at these differences. There's a contradiction. Well, he doesn't ever contradict himself in terms of what he's teaching, but the description or what is said in the sermon maybe comes a little bit in a different order, things like that. But again, it's not, Luke is recounting something Jesus taught, but maybe not from this particular moment, where he's doing the specific, on this day. It might have been a different day where he preached it in a little bit different order or something like that. Now also, like Moses at Sinai, Jesus here is teaching from a mountain and teaching principles of law. And so many believe that this is meant to parallel the beginning, of the new covenant with the beginning of the old covenant, that this is sort of the Sinai moment for the new covenant for Jesus and his ministry. So yeah, it's there's some cool things there. Won't have a lot of time to talk about all that, but just wanted to give you a little bit of historical. And then within the sermon, where this section kind of falls is right after just the Beatitudes, some preliminary statements about people being the light of the world, that kind of thing, salt of the earth. He makes those comments. And then he talks about this, which leads him into talking about specific commands through the next big section of the sermon. All right, so that's basic context around what we're hearing. And another thing I don't think I wrote down, but this is being preached to Jews. These are not Gentiles there. I mean, who's to say? Maybe there were some Gentiles there, but basically Jesus came to preach to Jews. The gospel doesn't go to Gentiles till later. Not that he doesn't have any dealing with Gentiles at all, but this is primarily he's teaching to people who are Israelites. They have the law, that kind of thing. So let's go ahead and jump into the text. All right. So let's go ahead and read it. It says, starting in verse 17, "Do not think that I have come to destroy the law or the prophets. I have not come to destroy them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one tiny letter or one stroke of a letter will pass away from the law until all takes place. Therefore, whoever abolishes one of the least of these commandments and teaches people to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps them and teaches them, this person will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness greatly surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter into the kingdom of heaven." All right, so that's the section we're going to be looking at. Now, there's a couple places, especially verses, really 17, 18, and 19 are the ones where the people have a lot of disagreement about, but I think 20 is very important, as we're going to see as we go through it. So let's talk about verse 17. One thing I like about this, you may have heard talk about this verse, and they'll talk more about abolish versus fulfill. And you notice this translation I used says destroy rather than abolish. And I think this is a better word. It more accurately carries the meaning of kataluo, the Greek word. If you look up that word and see where else it's used in the New Testament, it uses other words like destroy, destroyed, thrown down, overthrown, overthrow, that kind of stuff. It does also have some other meaning related to getting lodging. I have no idea why, but I didn't include that here. But it is used for that. So I'm, maybe just a homophone in Greek there that is just it's like a different word, but it sounds exactly the same. I don't know. But anyway, relevant to what we're talking about, this idea of destruction, being thrown down, being overthrown, the majority of the texts that you find the word in with those types of translations are actually referring to the destruction of the temple. Jesus says, destroy this temple and I will raise it in 3 days. And actually Jesus is doing a little play on words, because that's in John 2, where he's actually talking about his own body and the destruction of his own body. But he also does talk about how the temple will be destroyed and all that sort of thing. So, and he's using this term. This is the term. Fulfill is the word plerao. And this verse, so we've got destruction, which means to come against, to destroy. Then we've got fulfill, plerao. And there's a lot of meanings you can see here. Filled. It does mean finished in Luke 7:1, made complete. It's completed in John 7:8 and Acts 12:25. Past is and past is referring to time there in Acts 24:27, just once some time had passed, or it means filled up as well. So what does it mean here in Matthew? Well, if we look at these other, we'll get to that, but let's talk about the fact that it is being used. Let's talk about these different renderings of these two words. When you look at other ways it's translated, one mistake a lot of people make, and I think that we need to be careful of and not make this mistake, is to look for other meanings or other things that we like better. Well, this one doesn't make sense to me, but I like this one over here, and so we just kind of throw it on there. That's a mistake. We don't just kind of pick and choose a good translation. We try to understand the meaning within the context of the passage it's in. There's I don't know who coined it, but there's a saying that, words don't have meanings, sentences have meanings, and words, they can be used a number of ways. You don't really know what someone means. If I just point off and I say duck, am I telling you to duck your head, or am I pointing at a duck? You have no idea just from the word itself. Even from me pointing, you need more context from right there to know the meaning of the word that I'm using. You can't just look it up in a dictionary and say, that's the definition. Okay, now I know. No, you have to look at the context. But looking at these other ways that a word is rendered does help us, because it helps us see that a general feel. So number one there, shows the general feel of the word. The term kataluo for destroy is inherently, it's antagonistic, whereas fulfill is inherently harmonious. It's talking about, to fill up or fulfill, like to complete, to that kind of thing. It's not, there's no antagonism in the word fulfill. It also shows that, and seeing these other renderings of these two words specifically shows that it's a real facile argument to insist that any indication that fulfill ends something means that it must be equivalent to destroy. But that doesn't make any sense. You know, when we look back at how it's translated in these other passages, you know, in Luke 7, it's just saying like when, I can't remember exactly, I think it has to do when they were finished doing something, they went somewhere else. It was very, you know, it's a very mundane sort of text, you know, about just a very simple thing that happened. But if we say, oh, well, finished means it's just the same as abolish or destroy, so we could put kataluo in there, it doesn't make any sense. Yeah, when they destroyed what? It doesn't say what, you know what, because it's not what the word means. The word means, you know, something specific. But I point this out not to say that I think that Jesus is necessarily, I think that he's speaking of a sort of, you know, a kind of an end, but not, you know, I came to end the law is what he's really driving at. At least that's not the main point. I think what it actually means is something we can pull from the context, especially when we look at the rest of Matthew. So when you see, but let's start by looking at this verse and some of the other specifics, and we'll get to more about plerao. So in the verse, he says, I've not come to destroy the law or the prophets. So when you see that combination of law and prophets, realize that's a common way in the first century to refer to the whole Old Testament scriptures. You know, you may hear people, Jewish people or you know, Torah observant people today use the word Tanakh. Tanakh is a sort of a made-up word that's, you know, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's a made-up word that is based on an acronym of, you know, and I don't know the names of all the Hebrew letters, but basically T, N, and K, their Hebrew equivalents. You know, T for Torah, N for Nevi'im, and K for Ketuvim. And these words mean law, prophets, and writings. And this sort of threefold definition, which we also do see a little bit in the New Testament, maybe not with the word Ketuvim, but with Psalms. You know, there's a text somewhere that says, you know, in the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. And the reason they use the word Psalms for the writings is that it's the first book of the writings. So you have that so law, and my point of all that is to say, law and prophets, when you see those juxtaposed like that, you realize Jesus is talking about all of the scriptures. In fact, yes, the threefold, you know, designation was in use, but people often shortened it. So, you know, law, prophets, and writings. You know, some people would just say, well, yeah, in the law and the prophets, it says, and some would even further shorten it to just the law. So when we see it that way, we know he's speaking of the scriptures and not necessarily just talking about the parts containing commands. And subsequent verses discuss that commands are part of what he's talking about, but, you know, he includes the prophets here because he's talking about the whole scriptures, and we'll see that. Now, plerao, the word for fulfill, you know, he says, I've not come to destroy the law or the prophets, the scriptures, but have come to fulfill them. And this word appears 6 times in the first, up until this verse, up until this point in the text. So when he says law and when he says fulfill in verse, 122, 215, 217, 223, 315, and 414, every time it's talking about Jesus fulfilling some text, some prophetic text about him. And then it appears 12 times after this. So this would be the 7th time, and then there are 12 more. And every time except for 2 also refer to some text that Jesus is fulfilling. Matthew is, very kind of repetitive. He did this in order to fulfill, and cites an Old Testament text, and it's from the prophets typically, but it's some text that refers to Jesus prophetically. Now, so the most likely meaning of the term as we're looking at the book of Matthew is, because we don't just say, well, Luke, it meant end, so we're just going to pluck that and stick it in here. No, we don't just do that. I already told you we don't do that kind of thing, right? We look at the text itself and the context. And in the context of Matthew, the term plerao is repeatedly, vast majority of the time, used in terms of fulfillment of prophecy. And Jesus, again, he's not referring just to the law, but all of the scriptures. And he's saying, I came to fulfill. And obviously, it means to fulfill prophecy. Now, so when he says them, I've not come to destroy them. What is the them? Well, the them is the law and the prophets, right? And I've come to fulfill them, the law and the prophets. So he's not coming against the law or the prophets. He's not coming against anything in there, is what I hope you're gathering from this. He's coming to fulfill them as one fulfills prophecy. And that does, so does that end anything? Well, in a way, and we'll see this as we look at other things in more detail, but our relationship to a prophecy, if we live before the prophecy is fulfilled versus after, changes. When we look at a prophecy before it's fulfilled, our relationship to that prophecy as believers is to look at it as something that we are, we look at it in hope. We say, look, God has promised that this is what's, something that's going to happen, that's going to indicate something he's going to do, and we are awaiting that to occur. After the prophecy has been fulfilled, nothing is destroyed. The text is still there, and it's still true, just as true as it was before. But our relationship to the text has changed. Now we look at that prophecy and we see God's faithfulness, and we see it now as a kept promise, as opposed to a promise that we look on in hope. So there is something ended there. Our relationship to the text as it pertains to something future has ended. We don't, and so there's a fulfillment, there's a completeness. That concept of something coming to an end isn't completely absent, but it's not like the text goes away and we don't need to look at it anymore. It just changes with respect to how we relate. So, and I think that when as we look at the commands, and keep in mind, I don't think at this point, I think that in a broad sense, this verse is inclusive of specific commands, but it's not really the main focus of what Jesus is saying. Jesus is going to shift to talking about commands in a little bit, but I don't think that's really the main focus here. Now, so as we continue, we go to the next verse. So verse 18, he says, "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one tiny letter or one stroke of a letter will pass away from the law until all takes place." So again, we've got, he's setting up the persistence of the scriptures. He's saying, he parallels heaven and earth passing away with the letter, the smallest parts of the law passing away. But again, what does the law refer to? Now, I'm not saying that it absolutely has to be a certain way. I'm going to present what I think is going on here, but the law, again, is a shorthand way of referring to the scriptures. In John chapter 10, Jesus, says, "It is written in your law," and he's talking about Psalm 82. So, Psalm 82 is not part of the Torah. It's not part of the T part that is referred to by the term law. But again, it doesn't have to be, because this term, nomos, that Jesus is using, is is a title for that is sometimes used of all of the scriptures. And the fact that he just said the law and the prophets and what he's saying here seems to just continue that thought, makes me think that he's not talking about specific commands yet. He will, but he's talking about the scriptures, and they will not pass away. So some say, now some do talk about when he says heaven and earth, that he's talking about the temple, and they cite some extra biblical texts, some first century literature that seems to refer to the temple that way. But biblically, there aren't any references. In the text of Scripture, we don't have any references to the temple as heaven and earth. So I don't believe that when Jesus says heaven and earth here, he's talking about the temple. He's talking about the culmination of everything, in the heaven and earth passing away, and that not one little bit of the scriptures will be lost is what I believe he's saying here. And I think that the key phrase to understand this is the term pass away. So this is parerkomai, and I apologize if my Greek is no one really knows how ancient Greek was actually pronounced, but I apologize if it's not even close. Now it has a variety of renderings. So the term pass away is really just one word in the Greek. But in Matthew and the other Gospels specifically, it often seems to refer to destruction. So there's this phrase that happens in the Synoptics. Jesus says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. And notice the parallel here. He's talking about the law, which commonly refers to all the scriptures, and his own words will never pass away. And he's talking about, again, heaven and earth passing away. He also says this, when he says this generation, in Matthew 24:34, he says, this generation will not pass away until, you see the Son of Man. So coming in glory. So there's all that stuff going on. But again, this idea of pass away, it seems to entail a sort of destruction. And this is important as we try to understand the text. So there's not really any text I can find where this phrase or this word that for pass away means something like becomes no longer binding or something along those lines. So it's not, and so when he says not one letter will pass away from the law, he's not saying specifically not one letter will become no longer binding from the law. What he's saying is not one letter will be destroyed or lost from the law. That the words will never pass away. The text of Scripture will be preserved. We will have the Scriptures all the way to the end. Is what I believe he's talking about, the promise of preservation of God's word. There's not really any text again that uses this idea of whether it becomes relevant. And there's as I mentioned, the term law and prophets, law is used the same way as that title. I said some of this stuff and I wrote it down in a different place, but John 10, I mentioned, he cites Psalm 82 calling it law. In context, he promised in verse 17 he would not come to destroy the scriptures but fulfill them. In verse 18, he promises that the words will endure to the end, until all has been fulfilled, until everything takes place. And I think, and it went on. I want to point out one other thing, and I think I'll get to this in a sort of, I've got some anticipated objections I'll kind of get to at the end. But I want to point out when, consider the term, this word for pass away, what's the likelihood Jesus means two different things, by this term? When he says until heaven and earth pass away, what does that mean? Does it mean till heaven and earth become no longer morally relevant or something like that? No, it means until heaven and earth are destroyed, are laid low through the judgment of God, until they are destroyed, and not one stroke or letter will pass away from the law, will be destroyed. And so I don't think pass away here is really even referring to whether or not it's still relevant, to us. But keep in mind, I think, as I hope I've expressed at this point, none of it stops being relevant. It's just, again, what is our relationship to it? And we'll, and I'm giving you that as sort of that I think I've proven it at this point, but as a primer, so you kind of understand where I'm going. But you'll see as we begin to draw the meaning out of the text, that's really where I believe Jesus is going. So, but here the main thing to take away, verse 18, God will preserve his word through all of history, and that's the main gist of 18. Now in 19, here's what he says. Therefore, so now, based on what I've said, God's word, I'm not here to destroy it. It will not be destroyed. It will endure till the end. That's the main thrust of 17:18. Because of that preservation of God's word, therefore, whoever abolishes one of the least of these commandments and teaches people to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps them and teaches them, this person will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So this is a conclusion based on an argument, so to speak. He's taught something, and now he's drawing out a conclusion from that. The question here is this: what is he referring to? When he says these commandments, is he still talking about the same law, which I've taken to basically just be a reference to the scriptures as a whole, as opposed to specific commands, but including commands? Is he talking about that or something else, or has there been a shift? And I would submit that there has been a shift, and I would point that out by looking at the terminology. So in verse 17, he says, I've not come to kataluo, the destroy, but plerao, to fulfill. And he's speaking of nomos, the law, which is, again, sometimes the title for all the scriptures. Here in verse 19, he doesn't use the term kataluo. He uses luo, which is, as you can see, it's part of that, but it's a smaller word. And this word gets translated as abolish, here in this translation, also as loosen, or, you may have heard, anyone who loosens one of these commandments, which I think is not a bad one, but but luo is less confrontational than destroy. It's just sort of a, kind of getting rid of something. And then instead of fulfill, he uses the word poieo, which is keep. But whoever keeps them, so he's not even talking about fulfill now. And now he's talking about entole. I may be getting these wrong. I'm not very good at the Greek letters. I left it only here in the Greek letters because I want to practice my Greek. Anyway, he's talking about commandments. So before he's talking about, he used the word law. Now he's using the word commandments, and he says these commandments. So I think he's using all different words now than what he used before. Obviously, there's a relationship because he said therefore, but he's now talking in his own, in different language. So obviously now he's certainly talking about commandments, but because he's not using the same commandments, the key question, or the same language, the key question is, what are these commandments? Is he talking about the commandments of the Torah specifically, or is he talking about the commandments that he's going to present going forward in just the next few verses of the sermon and continue on with? Which one is it? Or is it just both, or is it just all inclusive? So consider, again, we're drawing meaning out of the text. Consider what we've gleaned. He came to fulfill the law. And that is based on the whole context of Matthew, comparable to fulfilling prophecy. Doesn't change the truth of the text. It's still just as true, but it does change our orientation towards it. He shifts from the perpetuity of Scripture. Scripture, it will not pass away until it is, fulfilled or it is accomplished. Now he's talking about keeping commandments. And so he's using new language. He's talking about a new thing. He goes on to make contrast, after this, between laws and customs and his own teaching. He goes on to say, "You have heard, but I say," and does this over and over, sometimes with straight up commands right out of the Torah, sometimes with, just traditions and things that were, maybe in the Talmud or things like that. Also, he refers here to the future kingdom of heaven. So he's now shifting our minds forward. He was talking about the past, the law, the prophets. I'm not here to destroy those things. But now he's talking about what's going to happen in the kingdom. So he's shifting to forward thinking and future thinking. So I think these are good reasons to think that these commandments, when he says, whoever abolishes one of the least of these commandments, is really about what he's teaching, what his own teaching is, and not necessarily about the Torah. Now, it's not, again, he's not saying, okay, so it's okay to just, ignore the Torah, as we're going to see, and not in this episode, but in a later one, when he talks about the laws of the Torah, he amplifies many of them in terms of his teaching. So it's not that he's saying, forget the old stuff, I got the new stuff. It's just that this text seems to me to be pointing to, I'm taught, what Jesus is going to teach here. So I think that's all of these sort of differences point in that direction. Now, the obvious conclusion to those who know the rest of Scripture, is there's a greater truth. Okay. Oh, sorry. I didn't realize I went to the next verse. So the next verse, so that's 19. Now, verse 20, the last verse we're going to look at, says, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness greatly surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter into the kingdom of heaven." Now, the obvious, to any well-trained Christian, the conclusion we see is, oh, well, you have to have the righteousness of Christ. That's how your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees. And I do believe that is in the mind of Christ when he's saying this. But he has a way in the Gospels of getting people to come to that conclusion that on their own by basically holding them up to the law and saying, here's, you want salvation, here's the standard, and they can't meet the standard, and it teaches them that they need to get their righteousness somewhere else, and he promises that. He says, I will give you rest. It's not going to depend on your work, but it's a teaching method of getting them there. So I think that is sort of an ultimate truth that is being alluded to here. But I think that, that doesn't tell us necessarily what he means by these commandments. But, we're going to see some other evidence that seems to show he's talking about his own teaching here. So the scribes and Pharisees, they were regarded by the people as the best among them. So if anyone had a life of holiness down, it was them. At this point in the text, again, Jesus has not condemned Pharisees. And so we don't have anything from the context at this point in our reading to suggest that he's condemning them in this text. And I think he's clearly drawing from their reputation among the people as being the holy ones, the really good, folks. After all, why would it be a great thing to surpass those terrible, wicked Pharisees? He's not, when he says it must greatly exceed that, I don't believe he's saying, it must greatly exceed the worst sinners among you. Your righteousness has to exceed the highest example you see, that you think is the highest example of righteousness. It must be much higher than that.
And so if you think about it, what way were scribes and Pharisees righteous? What way could they be considered that way? Well, they strove hard to keep all the commandments of Moses, and they had a bunch of other commandments. And a lot of folks look at that and they say the reason they had all these other commandments was in order to, if all the commandments sort of create an area where you don't go here, they put their own commandments as a fence around that area, so they don't even get close to disobeying the commandment. And that's kind of the idea. But it ends up being a just proliferation of laws and traditions that end up sometimes contradicting some of those laws. But their goal was, we want to keep all the commands of Moses. So, but consider that, Jesus says keeping and teaching these commandments makes one great in the kingdom. So these commandments, if the Pharisees really aren't, if we have to exceed them, then whatever they're teaching isn't what makes you great in the kingdom. And they were, some people say, oh, it's just all about their traditions. Well, that Jesus certainly condemned that, but he also condemned even their own self-righteousness. He talks about you tithe, the mint and cumin and all that, but you neglect the weightier portions of the law. He says, or he puts it, you should have done that and do the other thing also. His point is, like, you're so focused on these ceremonial aspects that you're neglecting the other stuff that's much more important. So, the other thing is to notice here that he doesn't say anything like, the Pharisees keep the wrong commandments in their traditions. Jesus here isn't mentioning traditions. He hasn't mentioned traditions. In fact, again, at this point in the text, he hasn't condemned Pharisees. He's just said, you have to surpass them in your righteousness. So he's speaking in terms of degree, not necessarily like they're doing the wrong thing and you need to do the right thing. He's saying, no, what they're doing, you need to do even better and more. You need to do something that exceeds what they do. So Jesus, that would mean, and especially as we see this later on, that Jesus' commands exceed the Torah. They point to a higher righteousness than the Torah commands that they're looking at. So that's through the just sort of verse by verse, but what sort of conclusions can we draw from the whole text? So as a whole, consider, this is a passage talking about Jesus' own relationship to the text of Scripture. He starts by talking about fulfilling all of Scripture, continues by saying that Jesus' commands are those kept and taught by those great in the kingdom. His commandments exceed those taught by the Pharisees, set a higher standard. So in a nutshell, if we're just talking about this text itself, these 4 verses, Jesus, is not, I think, trying to say, hey, just keep doing everything the way they always did it. Because what is fulfillment if, otherwise? But he's also saying, don't throw it out either. And it's the key thing is, I believe he's talking about, you need to listen to my words, and that's how, and I'm about to expound on the commandments that would make you great in the kingdom of heaven, and that teaching would make you great in the kingdom of heaven. So I think that's really what the passage is about. And I've kept myself from talking about a lot of opposing views and things like that. So I wanted to bring those in kind of here at the end to, because people present this text a number of ways. But I think I think that those things just kind of look at it somewhat superficially and don't really draw the meaning out the way that I think we've done. So let's consider some objections to what I said. So one objection you hear all the time, you hear this from Hebrew roots, Torah observant folks that I've talked about a lot. If fulfill means that it ends something, then it's really just equivalent to abolish, and therefore it can't mean that, because, he said, I did not come to abolish. I didn't come to do away with the law. And I agree, he didn't. This is why I like the term destroy better than abolish. We're used to kind of seeing this text, and we just think abolish means, nullify, make it not. But nullifying something doesn't carry that antagonistic, come against, overthrow sort of feeling that the term destroy does, which I think is better. And it's really a canard. It can't really be proven. If I can show, as I think I have, that there is a different and meaningful contrast between the two terms, abolish and fulfill, then there's really no reason from the text to insist on this bad argument. It's like, no, it really can mean that something ends without meaning destroy or about being totally equivalent to that. If I finish a project and it's finished, and I complete it, I plerao it, I didn't destroy it. These are not the same words, and saying I completed is not equivalent to saying I destroyed it. Now, I don't think, like I said, I think that in the context, Jesus isn't saying the law is complete and done. Jesus is saying the law is fulfilled. Like all other prophetic texts, it's all about me, and it's all fulfilled, and we relate to it now in the context of being, of the fulfillment, and that's going to change the way we approach it. Another one is argument against what I say here is that scholars disagree with you. So, yes, some scholars disagree with what I presented tonight, and I don't care. You can find scholars on all sides of any issue. This is well known. And I would say that scholarship is really valuable for work in data and finding patterns and things like that. But often their conclusions are not well reasoned. They have, everybody, including scholars, has biases, and that colors the ultimate conclusions that they come to. Even if they see the text and they say, yeah, I see the text here, but I'm going to go over here for my conclusion because, of reasons. So I don't care what a scholar concludes. I will listen to people who are who are smarter than me and know more about it than me to understand their reasons for what they conclude. But if the two don't really connect logically in a compelling way, then I'm like, well, that's cool, and I thank you for I've learned more about this text, but I still don't accept your conclusion. So, if you have an objection to what I said and you like a certain scholar's argument against it, I welcome you to reproduce it and we can examine its value. Just citing a scholar that says anyone who says this is silly is itself silly. Another objection, David Wilbur responded to you on this. So, you may not know, I haven't really talked about this on this show, but a few months ago, a person who works for 119 Ministries but has his own YouTube channel as well, David Wilbur, he said, he's Torah observant. He doesn't really like the Hebrew roots label, but whatever. He responded to something I wrote on this, and I want to make a couple points about it. So about 3 months ago, he responded to a blog series I did on this passage that I wrote over 2 years ago. And that series was really meant to show possible alternatives to the standard sort of Hebrew roots position. And it did that. It showed, here's some reasons why you don't have to come to the conclusion that they did. And he didn't really refute that those were, other possible, things you could come to. mainly his video uses the sort of scholars disagree argument. He did that a lot in the video, and that's a appeal to authority. It doesn't carry any real weight without seeing the arguments themselves. And this video, what I'm presenting tonight, it really reflects continued refinement on, that was from a long time ago. And I find it curious that out of all that I've produced, dozens and dozens of video content on the Hebrew Roots movement, I've done a whole series that I'm still going to finish someday, talking about the gospel and going through, verse by verse, pretty much through Paul's writings through. I did Galatians and Romans to show that the Torah observant Hebrew Roots position on Paul is untenable, that they can't walk through the text like that. He didn't respond to any of that stuff that was more recent. Took one of the very first things I ever did on the text. And again, so I'm not saying because it's old I don't agree with it anymore, but I'm just trying to express that it wasn't intended to be what I think this video really is, which is let's see what the text says in context without the context of what the antagonists say. Let's just look at the text itself. And I looked at the text in that series, but it was more to talk about the Hebrew Roots movement's arguments and how you don't have to read it the way that they do. Also, he falsely made the claim that I simply assumed my view of Hebrews and imported it into Matthew 5. So I'll get to that in a moment. That he didn't really substantiate it. He just asserted that. And the blog series lays that argument out clearly. It doesn't just assume, oh yeah, well look at Hebrews, therefore, we have a problem here in Matthew. So the last thing, and then we will go to your questions, are some challenges and implications that I want to draw from this text, again, for those who would disagree with what I'm presenting here tonight. There are some serious Torah observant / Hebrew Roots deficiencies when it comes to this text. I've not come across any argument from the text to substantiate the statement that if you think fulfill means to bring to an end, it's the same as abolish. That's always just been flatly asserted, never defended from the text. As I hope we've shown tonight, careful reading, understanding the meanings of the words shows that there is a meaningful contrast that is much better and more faithful to the text than the sort of end versus continue paradigm that the Torah observant Hebrew Roots folks are using. There really is a big problem with interpreting pass away in verse 18 as change in practice or become not binding, or whatever they want it to mean, because it ignores that the same word is used in the same verse about heaven and earth. So it's got to carry pretty much the same meaning toward both those things. And second, it requires that literally every command must be in principle still in effect in the same way that it always was. But this is contradicted on several levels. So now I'll briefly talk about Hebrews, and I'm just going to do this one section here, and then we'll be pretty much here at the end. So Hebrews 10, 1-4 says this. It says, "For the law, possessing a shadow of the good things that are about to come, not the form of the things itself, is never able, year by year, by means of the same sacrifices which they offer without interruption, to make perfect those who draw near. For otherwise would they not have ceased to be offered, because the ones who worship, having been purified once for all, would no longer have any consciousness of sins. But in them there is a reminder of sins year by year. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins." So Hebrews clearly states that the sin offering, and I'm specifically talking about that one, not all the other offerings, because I don't need to talk about the other ones. Remember, it's the tiniest stroke of the pen, right? That wouldn't pass away. The sin offering would have ceased if it could have taken away sins. But then Jesus' sacrifice did take away sins, so it has ceased. That's inescapable from the text. In what sense, I would ask, is the sin offering specifically, still in effect when we don't have any sin to atone for because of Christ? I'm not talking about cleanliness laws or being clean to go into the temple or any of that stuff. I'm talking about the sin offering to take away God's judgment and grant forgiveness. That's what the Torah says the sin offering does. But now Jesus has done that specifically. It clearly says then in Hebrews 10:9 that he takes away the first to establish the second. So, some have argued that, well, it's two different lines of sacrifice. And I think there's a little bit of truth to that. I think that when the Old Testament sacrifice took away, it didn't take away sins, but when it said it forgave or atoned for sin, it's speaking of an earthly culpability. You look in Deuteronomy at the judgment, and I talked about this a little bit ago when I talked about sacrifices, but when you look at the sin offering and or when you look at the judgments in Deuteronomy, the blessings and the judgments, blessings and curses, that kind of stuff, all of the curses are earthly. It says, if you disobey, you will have famine, you will be, have pestilence, you have enemies that will scatter you, you'll go into captivity. It's all earthly things, earthly consequences for their sins. It's being saved from those consequences that the forgiveness and the atonement and all that stuff in the law is pointed to. It's a real atonement, but it's an earthly one. Jesus' sacrifice is the real atonement for sin that actually takes away sins, as Hebrews talks about. But so some have argued that the sin offering is still in effect, but it's only in the way that it was always in effect, not referring to taking away sins. And I say, well, that's true as so far as it goes, but that's not the argument that the author of Hebrews is making. In verse 9 of this chapter, he says, he takes away the first to establish the second. He takes away the sin offering that doesn't actually take away sin to establish the second, the real offering of Christ that does take away sin. So if the Torah observant position that the tiniest part of the law will not pass away means all things remain, then how does the sin offering remain? Again, based on what we see there, Hebrews is coming at the same issue from a different angle, but it's pointing to it. I don't think it's all based on, just taking that conclusion of Hebrews. We got our conclusion from Matthew without use of Hebrews, but there's a huge problem with Hebrews if you take a different conclusion from Matthew. And what about, there's some other issues. How do Levites continue to break camp in the wilderness? FYI. So this Numbers 10:8 talks about Aaron's sons and them breaking down camp, the temple, to move to somewhere else in the wilderness. And it says that this is a command forever. It's everlasting. But once they got to the land and went to their houses, they didn't do this anymore. There was no purpose, for that particular command anymore. It was specific to specific people at a specific time, just like all the way back in Genesis. But if not the tiniest part will pass away means not the tiniest part of the law will stop being, needing to be imposed, then how come you don't know they didn't keep doing that? Where does God judge them for not doing that anymore? Again, if it will not pass away, why has it passed away? Really, what we see is that the term for pass away doesn't mean no longer be binding or something along those lines. It means get destroyed, and the law will not be destroyed, not one bit of it. It will all be there, and it will all be relevant in some way, but it will be fulfilled. And how that looks, we'll get into even more as we continue in this series. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and go to your questions. So let me go ahead and pull that up real quick. Actually, see if I can just grab it from right here. Alrighty, so I know we had some, saw some of them kind of zip by in the chat. Okay, question from Max Hyatt. Can you please break down Matthew 23, 1 through 3? So let's go ahead and look it up. 23. Okay, and let me show it to you guys so you can see what I'm reading. All right, so Jesus says, "Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, 'The scribes and the Pharisees sit on the seat of Moses. Therefore do and observe everything they tell you. But do not do as they do, for they tell others to do something and do not do it themselves.'" So, Jesus says, "Do as they tell you," right? And they're teaching the law of Moses. So here's the question is, and I'm guessing that the main point of the question is, shouldn't we continue to keep the law of Moses, just like what he's talking about? But notice that Jesus is speaking to the crowds and his disciples at this moment, and at this time, Jesus hasn't fulfilled the law yet. I mean, he hasn't done everything to bring about the he's taught on the coming, the gospel of the kingdom, the good news that of the kingdom of God, but he hasn't inaugurated it yet. And I think that the people he's talking to, they absolutely should continue to or they should do the things that that the law of Moses says. It's and in just the same way that it says it. This is happening historically prior to the death and burial and resurrection of Christ. So things did change at that point. And I don't think that means everything changed and everybody needed to stop doing the law or something along those lines. But things did change, but those things hadn't changed yet. So again, the other thing is consider the historical context is this is before the resurrection and the coming of the Spirit and all of that. But also, what's the main point of the passage? Again, is Jesus' main point in this passage to expound on how you should do the law of Moses? No. He's expounding on the fact that when the Pharisees just read from the Torah, you should do what they say because it's the Torah, it's the Word of God. But don't do what they do. And this is the main thrust of where he's going, is they tie up heavy burdens. They do all their deeds in order to be seen. They're hypocrites. He's talking about, that's where he's going. It's like, despite the fact that they at times do preach true things and you should do them because they're the Word of God, you don't try to be like them is the main point of the whole passage. And so it's just a historical, different historical spot that I think is, and I would say today, when you read the law of Moses, you should observe it, but you should observe it in light of the teaching of Christ and the apostles. Don't just read the law of Moses in its own context and grab and pretend that you can grab that context and apply it to yours, because the Christ came in between those two things, and we should take a pause and take a look at how the New Testament looks at it, and then read it in light of that today. But when Jesus said these words, that wasn't the case, and so there was no no other context except what it said in the book, law of Moses at the time. All right, Jeremiah Lawson asks the question: could verse 19 be talking about all the commands he's about to talk about? I think so. In a lot, I think, and we'll get into this in more detail in another. I'm not sure if next week we'll do the next part of this series, but in the next part of this series, we will be talking about the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. Maybe not every single verse, but how Jesus approaches the law in there and also in other parts of the Gospels. And I do think that, I believe that when he's talking about, he who keeps these commands, he's talking about his own basic teaching on the commandments of God. And that's what he's really getting at. Let's see. The next question comes from Francisco RM. He asks, what was Peter doing exactly in Galatians 2:12? Was he just sitting in the table with Gentiles, or was he eating unclean food with them? Some Hebrew roots argue that he was not eating unclean food. So Hebrews 2, it says, or sorry, not Hebrews, Galatians 2. Let's go take a look. And I hope that everybody hears. I mean, we don't, it doesn't, your question doesn't have to be about what we talked about tonight directly. But, because, Galatians 2, we didn't talk about that, but there's some good stuff. So in Galatians 2:12, let's go ahead and read the text. We'll start in verse 11. It says, but when Cephas, who is Peter, when he came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he was condemned. For before certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he withdrew and separated himself because he was afraid of those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews also joined in his hypocrisy with him, so that even Barnabas was carried away from them in their hypocrisy. But when I saw they were not being straightforward with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in the presence of them all, if you, although you are a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you try to compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? So I think that the main thing going on is Peter was sitting with the Gentiles, and it's important, if you look at the concept of table fellowship throughout Old New Testament, like who you eat with is someone they're part of, your community. They're, when they come to your table, when you're together, it's a way of talking about someone being part of the kingdom, being accepted. It's a really important thing. So for Peter to stop doing that with the Gentiles, it isn't just him being rude. He may not mean to be doing it, but he is symbolically basically kicking them out of the kingdom. So it's very important. This is a big deal, and this is why Paul brings it up. But the question, and I think the question is more likely tied to verse 14 there, where he says, although you are a Jew, you live like a Gentile. Does that mean he ate unclean food, unclean meat? It's hard to say for sure, but I wouldn't, hang my hat on it to say, oh yeah, he was definitely eating the unclean stuff. Maybe I don't, again, my position theologically is that's, Jesus declared all foods clean, and it does say that. It's not a translator insertion or something. He really did. And Paul taught all foods are clean, all that kind of stuff. So I think Peter, it would have been fine for him to have been eating, meats that the Gentiles ate. But it's also fine not to. It's also fine if he wanted to continue to keep those dietary laws for himself. There's nothing wrong with that either. So, but I've never heard a compelling, definite repudiation of him eating unclean, what the the Jews considered unclean, that could, survive, that really makes, draws the meaning out, like we're trying to do in Matthew. From this text, it says, you live like a Gentile. What does that mean? You live like a Gentile. What does he say? And he's kind of saying this to Peter in the present of this situation. So he's already withdrawn from the Gentiles and it's just eating with the Jews. And Paul is saying, but you live like a Gentile. Well, what does that mean? Now you live like one, but you won't eat with them. And now you're trying to compel Gentiles to live like Jews. What's going on? I really think he's, I think that what he's eating may be part of that, but I don't see a real solid, drawn from the text sort of meaning of live like a Gentile that doesn't include in some way not doing the ceremonial parts of the law the same way that the Jews do. I mean, what else could it mean? You live like a Gentile means, I don't know, not keeping the traditions of the rabbis. I don't know. I've heard people try to insert all kinds of things in there, but he's mainly talking. I don't think that's the main point of the text. Talking about what he eats, but I think he is. That could be included in it as a something to look at. All right. Let me see. That is what I've got there from that section. Let me just double check here real quick and see what else. Seeing lots of good comments going by and always good discussions. So one thing I want to point you guys to, like I mentioned at the beginning, like I said at the beginning, definitely check out, if this is your first time seeing the show, or maybe not your first time seeing the show, but your first time in this series. This is part 6 of this series, so definitely check out that playlist in the description, and I will continue this series. I've got at least 3, maybe 4 more episodes on Jesus, and then we'll talk about the other apostles, Peter, Paul, that kind of stuff, and kind of conclude everything. I've kind of given you some of my conclusion already as far as the Christian and the law, but we're going to start to see that even more and more explicitly right there in the text. So with that, I thank you guys so much for being here. I'm glad I could be with you, and I look forward to seeing you next week. You guys have a good one.